Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Pilots, what's the scariest stuff you've seen while flying? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Power lines directly in front of me at night that weren't charted and were exactly at helicopter grabbing altitude. Smoke in the cockpit when I landed. Thankfully, it was when I landed. Had to push the airplane, small Cessna, off the runway. Almost had two mid-air collisions, one due to a new pilot not being where he should be, another due to control telling me an aircraft was at my 11 o'clock when really it was at my 2 o'clock. And the coolest was a meteor that burned up directly in front of me. Same altitude, straight ahead. I have no idea how far away it was, but it was bright and so pretty. Went through a spectrum of colors as it burned. Not a pilot, but I was in the bathroom when the pilot came over the radio with a quick announcement that we were about to have turbulence and to buckle up. Everyone sat down, including the stewardesses, and buckled up. Everyone but me, who was in the process of taking a massive shit. The kind of shit you don't want to have during turbulence. Now, I've been in turbulence. It's rough. This was something else. I somehow, by all that was mighty, finished my shit and completed the post-shit paperwork and flushed. Didn't want to chance it. When the turbulence hit. To say I hit everything is an understatement. I bounced off the ceiling, hit the floor, back up, face to the toilet. It was hell, and I just kept my face covered and I protected my head as best I could. After a bit of luck, I managed to get myself wedged under the toilet and I stayed there until the bumpy ride ended. I left the bathroom to some laughter and a lot of concern. See, for them in their seats it was fine, until they heard screaming in the bathroom and loud crashing noises, followed by dread silence. They all thought I died. An interesting perspective from a pilot's point of view. What really goes on in the cockpit while we eat pretzels. Airline pilot here, reposting my previous answer. I'm an airline captain based out of LAX. The following is the closest I've come to biting it thus far in my career. On a commercial flight, you generally have three sources of bleed air that take air from the engines and a little device in the back of the airplane called the APU, and use it to pressurize the cabin. You can't breathe the air at 35,000 feet, so the cabin is pressurized by these bleed air sources to a breathable altitude of at or below 8,000 feet. There are three sources because 1, redundancy increases safety, and 2, you can still dispatch the airplane if one is not because there are backups. One of the bleed sources, or the number 2 engine, was already broken, so maintenance deferred it, indicating we were still safe to fly on the remaining 2 sources, which is totally fine. You just take off with the APU running as a backup bleed source. Well, on the takeoff roll, immediately after becoming airborne, our APU fails, which leaves us just one bleed source to pressurize the cabin. The bleed air from the number 1 engine. If that fails, we have nothing to keep the air inside the cabin pressurized to a lower altitude than the airplane is flying at. You won't be able to breathe at high altitudes. It's a short flight, and we aren't going up too high, so I'm optimistic that we can get to our low cruising altitude, message dispatch and maintenance, and receive their agreement that the flight is safe to continue on one bleed source. I text our company a message describing the situation via ACARS, a satellite-based texting capability our aircraft has to communicate with people on the ground. But they never had the chance to get back to us. Passing through 25,000 feet, I go to inhale but feel the air gently move out of my lungs instead of into them. Unable to breathe normally, immediately my eyes shoot to the cabin altitude gauge, which is showing us at 8,000 feet cabin altitude and rising quickly. That explains the reverse air movement. In fact, the cabin altitude is rising at the exact same rate of climb as our airplane, indicating the airplane has lost all pressurization capabilities and is depressurizing rapidly. At that instant, we get a warning chime and message on our EICAS, Engine Information and Crew Alert System, essentially a computer screen that tells us when shit goes wrong, that says Bleed 1 fail. With our Bleed 1 source now failed, our APU having failed on the takeoff roll, and Bleed 2 already deferred, we are completely out of ways to pressurize the aircraft. If we don't descend to a safe altitude immediately, the cabin altitude will rise high enough that the air is no longer breathable. This is a serious problem. High cabin altitude killed everyone on board Helios Airways Flight 522, and there are countless other examples of depressurization causing injuries and fatalities. Immediately, I throw off my sunglasses and headset and don my full-face oxygen mask and smoke goggles. It provides 100% pure oxygen under a forced flow rated up to an altitude of 41,000 feet. My first officer does the same. This is the first thing you do because if the pilots die, there's nobody to fly the jet and everyone else dies. Then we immediately declare an emergency and initiate an emergency descent, nosing over to our maximum speed while deploying the speed brakes to generate maximum drag. We received clearance down to 10,000 feet and begin executing a 180-degree turn to go back to LAX. ATC does a fantastic job vectoring aircraft out of our way. SoCal airspace is some of the busiest in the world, but we got priority handling all the way back to LAX. The cabin altitude nearly reached hazardous levels, but didn't go high enough for the oxygen masks in the cabin to automatically deploy. It was definitely high enough that the passengers would have noticed, but wouldn't have had concrete idea of what was going on aside from, "That's odd." The cabin also got quite hot because there was no more pressurized, conditioned air flowing to cool it off. We landed at LAX on the longest runway with the fire trucks rolled to assist us just in case. Fortunately, none of the passengers or crew reported any injuries from the sudden increase in cabin altitude. We parked at the gate and deplaned, and I made an announcement to the passengers about what had just happened, using small words and downplaying everything so as not to scare the shit out of everyone. 12 Chinese passengers on our flight were on a West Coast tour, and they were very upset that their trip was inconvenienced by this emergency. No problem. I totally understand the frustration. So I spoke to their translator, who spoke in turn to her group, and I gave her the full and very detailed explanation of what happened. As I explained what happened, the expressions on the 12 passengers' faces went from angry to surprised to fearful and finally thankful. Before I walked away, all 12 of them bowed to me in respect. That was something I have never experienced before or since then in my entire aviation career. We ended up swapping airplanes to one that wasn't sick and completed the flight as planned about 3 hours behind schedule. I slept well that night, and the passengers probably went on to complain about their flight being delayed several hours due to a maintenance issue. Navy career pilot here. My story is more about what I couldn't see. I joined a squadron on deployment near Guam for a couple months one time. It had been about 6 months since I had landed on a carrier, so I had to do a few day and night passes to get current again. My first night with them, the plan was for me to get 2 traps. We would come down as the first plane in the recovery, launch again, and come back in as the last plane in the recovery. Nothing crazy. We do it all the time to keep both pilots current. The only thing different is I would fly both passes. This night was overcast, so no moonlight made it, though, to the surface of the ocean, making it very dark when you descend through the clouds. It's also in the middle of the ocean. It's so dark that you can't tell where the water ends and the sky starts. Not that it mattered, though, because we were still in the clouds down at 1,200 feet. As we were coming down first in the conga line of aircraft on 2-minute intervals, we hear paddles, the pilot on the back of the ship who helps guide you down. Say 99, the deck is moving. This means that the flight deck is pitching or rolling and or heaving with the ship's motion more than it usually does. This happens occasionally, and it's always a bit sketchy, but that's what paddles is there for. Anyway, as we are flying our needles down toward the ship, we passed 400 feet at about 1 mile, and we're still in the clouds in the dark. We get to the normal handoff point between the approach controller and paddles at 3/4 of a mile. Approach says, "Show you on and on. At 3/4 mile, call the ball." This is the point where we would look outside and confirm that we see the lights of the ship that guide you in the correct glide scope. In carrier aviation, if you can't see the ball or you don't know where you are on a glide slope, for some reason you say "Clara," meaning clarify my position. At least that's what I always assumed it stood for. And paddles will step in on the radio and give you some help. Well, in this case, we can't even see the ship, so we respond with "Clara, ship." Paddle comes back with 601 taxi light on. That means they can't see us either, and they need us to turn the taxi light on so they know where we are. We turn the taxi light on and Paddle says, "Paddle's contact," and continues to talk us down toward the deck. We're probably passing through 150 feet here. Eventually, we finally break out, and about 3 to 5 seconds later, we hit the deck and come to a stop. It was raining so hard, we could barely see the taxi director on the deck. They taxi us to the bow catapult, and we shoot off into the darkness to do it again, lol. Luckily, the weather cleared a bit, and the deck steadied a bit for the second pass. That still remains the craziest thing I have done in an airplane. TL, DR. Night, IMC below mins, pitching deck carrier landing on my night requal flight. Not a pilot, but my dad is a former one. He once told me about how he almost crashed his Cessna because he hit some geese. He was actually preparing for a landing approach when he hit geese flying in a patch of fog. Windshield was completely shattered, and he and his passenger were covered in blood and feathers. They landed safely, but my dad was pretty scarred from that. He didn't quit flying because of that, but bird strikes remained a constant fear of his. Geese are large birds, and they did significant damage to that little plane. A skydiver, about 20 yards off my wing, was flying a 172 into uncontrolled field that I've flown into 100 times before, not knowing that after a 5-year ban in skydiving there, they were allowing it on a case-by-case request. While flying in, calling my position, I hear, "Skydiver in the air." My first thought was, I hope they aren't this direction, and then there he was. I had this image of him going through my prop. After that though, oh God, please don't let me kill this guy. Then I turned to, WTF just happened, and how did the pilot not call this out better? He flew off completely. Come to find out the pilot was flying his friend. It was a friend to skydive to his local field. I never did find the guy.
This next one almost sounds like a origin story for a superhero or something. Maybe a sorcerer?
My airfield, where I did my pilot training, had a waterway as the approach end of the runway, and oftentimes there were sailboats heading out to sea as you were coming in to land. Usually came in a little high since the runway was plenty long enough. One day, not long after I'd completed my first solo, I was doing my run-up, waiting for one of the regular pilots to land his low-winged sport airplane. He obviously didn't see the mast of a sailboat crossing, and he hit it. The plane cartwheeled down the runway and broke into pieces. I took my plane back to the tie-downs to clear the area, and then went to help him out of the plane before it caught on fire, which it didn't amazingly enough. The pilot broke both his hands at the wrists and fractured a whole bunch of stuff. Unfortunately, he was a surgeon. Not sure if he was able to work again. Needless to say, I was always very careful at approach after that. Not a pilot, but Air Force Combat Systems officer. We were on a military training route, pretty much what it sounds like, airspace that is supposed to be cleared out so military jets can practice maneuvers without worrying too much about civilian aircraft. We're at 300 feet AGL, cruising along at 420 knots, when any TCAS collision alert system using our board radar start blaring at us. We all look around and don't see anything around us, when suddenly some jackass in a little prop plane who wasn't squawking pulls into a climb about 50 feet off our nose. Pilot brakes hard to the right, and we narrowly avoided a mid-air collision. I'm not a pilot, but I took a few lessons years ago just from my experience. We were practicing landings, and as we lined up with the runway, we started our final. As we're going down, the instructor notices a shadow on the ground slightly to our right. It was another plane going to land on our runway and was above us. We had radioed our intentions earlier, but don't know if he did. The instructor took over and peeled off. The guy didn't land, just kept going. We circled and came in. Apparently, no one saw a damn thing. I've been pretty lucky in my short piloting career, only around 60 hours as of right now, and am still in training. The scariest thing I have seen is a bald eagle about 8 feet from my left wingtip. It was only 8 feet from the wingtip because me and my instructor dove and rolled the plane as soon as possible. Those large birds are a serious hazard to small aircraft. I was in a Cessna 172S. Be careful of your animal pilots.
Well, that certainly is one way to teach people a lesson.
Obligatory not me, but my dad. Also, not exactly scary, but super nasty. My dad used to work in the Air Force and was responsible for the mechanical engineering of the Lockheed C-130 Hercules airplanes. Part of his job was to complete the before-flight checklist, a huge list of things that need to be cleared in every plane or helicopter before flight. Another part of his job was occasionally training newbies in this position. On the first day of training, my dad always told the new guys to always check the engines for birds' nests. If the plane had been grounded for a while, seagulls and pigeons would often nest in the engines. This wasn't necessarily a problem for the engines, but more of a huge annoyance because the cleanup could last for hours if the engines happened to be turned on while a bird was inside. Anyway, he was once giving a demonstration about power control of each engine, and the newbies, who had completed their checklist for the first time that day, had forgotten to check the engine for birds. My dad noticed this and decided to teach them a lesson by stepping back while the pilot fired up the engine. The seagull inside got completely eviscerated, covering the new guys from head to toe in seagull guts and blood. They always remembered to check the engines after that. Poor seagull. Thunderstorms on either side when I was in a Cessna 152, a bit smaller than the C-172. They developed pretty quickly, and we thought we'd have to turn back, but there was a big enough opening to fly through. The windshield got nice and clean too. Another one was seeing the engine start shaking when a part of the oil system blew. I thought it would die on me and I would have to land in some farmland or on a small road. Fortunately, we ended up being stuck with one power setting, which was also pretty bad, and could fly it back to the airport.